One of the hottest trends in cycling right now is gravel riding. Whether it's the tech or the events, it seems to be something that the bike industry are pushing quite a lot. As always, that's created quite a lot of discussion over whether we really need any more kind of tech in the bike industry. Do we need gravel bikes, or can you just get away with what a lot of people think, something like a cross bike or a cross-country hardtail bike? Is it just the bike industry trying to sell us more bikes? Having ridden a lot of gravel events, I've already got an opinion on this, which is I'm not really sure. I've ridden all my gravel events on an XC hardtail, and I don't feel like it's cost me too much. Tom's opinion is a little bit different.
I'm a fan of gravel bikes. I've done a fair bit of gravel riding on specific gravel bikes and obviously ridden for years on non-specific gravel bikes. And for me, they make quite a lot of sense for the kind of riding that I like doing.
Yeah, so can you kind of tell me a bit more about what makes a really specific gravel bike kind of special for gravel riding? You know, what's the difference between that and say a cross bike or a cross-country bike?
So it's very easy to sort of look at a cross bike and a gravel bike and just from looking at it think, well, they're the same thing and they do the same things. And generally speaking, I'd agree that they are very similar. And I'd never deny that there's a lot of crossover between the two. However, if you dig a little bit deeper into a proper cross race bike and what one might call a proper gravel bike, there are some relatively significant differences that kind of define the two bikes differently. So I guess the first thing, UCI cyclocross rules mean you can't have tyres bigger than 33mm wide. So a lot of cross bikes will have enough mud clearance for this, but they tend to be a little bit tighter than say a gravel bike. Many gravel bikes are now coming compatible with up to 2-inch tyres on a 650B wheel. And in a 700C sense, they're coming with 45C tyres. So there's a lot of extra room in there, for example, for mud. The other thing is looking at the geometry of the bikes. A cross bike is designed for a short, hour-long race. It's designed to be carried. It's got to be lightweight. And the geometry is quite aggressive, so low front end, steeper angles. Whereas a gravel bike is more suited to arguably longer rides. So you've got a slightly more relaxed geometry, slightly higher at the front, just to make it comfortable if you're going to be riding out all day. That's not to say that you can't ride a cross bike all day long, and it's not to say that you can't race a cross race on a gravel bike. But there are those differences there, and that's, I guess, why the two different types of bike exist alongside each other. One of the other things you're starting to see now with cross, I guess, is that a lot of those bikes are becoming a bit more gravelly. So you're looking at slightly more relaxed geometry, slightly wider tyre clearances in there. So there's a definite blending of the two bikes together.
Yeah, again, as Tom says, a cross bike is a dedicated race bike, so you don't get features such as mudguard mounts or any kind of mounts for racks and stuff like that, which you would get on a gravel bike.
There are niches within gravel riding, of course, so you can get dedicated race gravel bikes which have road bike-like geometry, but with that extra tyre clearance and maybe aren't adventure focused at all. But generally speaking, yeah, they're kind of like adventure bikes, I guess, for taking those roads that you might not be too happy on your normal road bike.
So that's all well and good, but as I've already said, I've done a lot of gravel events and I've always done them on an XC race bike, a hardtail, so that's got front suspension, big tyres, relatively light, big wide flat bars, and I've never found that I've kind of been held up too much by using that bike, especially on the kind of more technical terrain. Perhaps on any road features, I find I'm going a lot slower. A cross-country bike for me was quite a good choice for those events.
And obviously a mountain bike or a dedicated mountain bike is going to be good on more technical terrain. So you've got the wider tyres for lots of grip, you've got say 100-120mm suspension at the front, and sort of a stance on the bike which is more suited to steep and more technical terrain, and that's undeniable. I think a lot of the gravel bikes that are coming out, so we're seeing things like the Cannondale Slate, which has the lefty Oliver fork, the Spesh, with its Future Shock stem system, and Lauf with its grip fork. So you're getting some of the control that you would get from a suspension fork in these gravel bikes, but in a position that is more efficient for crossing ground more effectively.
Yeah, kind of got to give that one to Tom, because I've done some of the gravel events I've done, they've been like 8-9 hours, and having your hands stuck in one position, you kind of, in the last few hours, you end up moving your hands around a bit because are knackered, but obviously with a drop barred gravel bike, you've got a few different positions to put your hands into, so that's definitely a plus for a dedicated gravel bike. One area where I think a cross-country bike does fall down, especially in gravel races or gravel events where you're trying to go quite quickly, is that they're just not very aero. You've obviously got a very upright position on a mountain bike and you're going to be catching a lot of wind, whereas with a gravel bike, narrower bars, you can tuck in a bit more and yeah, you save a bit more time on those faster sections. Then again, a cross-country bike is a lot better when there's any proper technical terrain. A few of the gravel events I've done 2 Rapha Prestiges. Each one had some really technical features like single track and really rocky descents where I definitely didn't want to be on either a dedicated gravel bike or a cyclocross bike. No matter how big the tyres were, I wanted to be on a mountain bike with good suspension and good tyres.
But it's probably fair to say that most of the 60 or 80 kilometres you did in that event was on smoother, more sort of cross or gravel applicable terrain.
Probably about 10% of any ride you do of these kind of gravel events, especially in the UK, 10% is kind of really tough terrain where a gravel or cross bike isn't suited. The rest of it, you'll definitely get down it on a gravel or a cross bike, but you won't be getting down as quickly or as comfortably as you would on a mountain bike. So playing devil's advocate, for someone who has either a decent mountain bike, decent cross bike, or even a decent road enduro bike, why should they even bother buying a gravel bike? Doesn't it seem like a bit of a indulgent if all those bikes kind of work okay in that situation?
I mean, I think any bike's an indulgence, necessarily don't really need to have a bike. So I guess one of the reasons why I like the gravel bike is, and see it as sort of almost a catch-all for everything but real mountain biking or like super like aero-focused, race-focused road biking, is the versatility of a gravel bike. So I can put skinny tyres on my gravel bike, and because it's got relatively road-like geometry, I can bash out a Century pretty easily with skinny tyres on. If I want to go to a cross race, okay, it's not quite as racy, not quite as aggressive as a true cross bike, and so long as I keep within that sort of the tyre regulations, if you're racing a UCI race.
On your gravel bike.
On your gravel bike, then you could do that. If you want to ride into town, into work, you can put your sort of slick but chunky tyres on there for grip and traction and comfort while you're going through potholes. You can kind of do it all. There's nothing that they're really bad at. Whereas I'd argue that a cross-country bike is bad at long distance, relatively tame things. A cross bike is really focused, and again, not so great at those really long rides. And a road bike, even an endurance road bike, isn't going to be able to cope with anything other than real mild off-road stuff.
Yeah, he's kind of got a point there. Which is frustrating. I do a lot of commuting on my mountain bike and it doesn't seem so bad, and I do a bit of road riding on my mountain bike as well. But even with people on road bikes and they put the hammer down, I'm getting dropped pretty quick, so yeah, they definitely lose a lot of efficiency there.
I think they're really versatile, interesting and fun bikes to ride. I've certainly ridden the gravel bike I've had my hands on recently far more than I expected I would, and the 10 grand road bike in my garage hasn't been touched in that time.
And you get to ride
a
lot of nice bikes. Yeah.
Anything we sort of kind of want to ride.
So I think we both agree that gravel bikes are good bikes. As in, they ride nicely, don't they? As someone that already owns a hardtail mountain bike, I'm still pretty sceptical to whether or not I'd need a gravel bike, whether I want a gravel bike. And again, I think someone that owns a cross bike where you can mount 2 bottles in it might think the same thing. Perhaps someone that's going to buy a bike for the first time, a kind of off-road bike for the first time, a gravel bike kind of makes a bit more sense in my head.
I understand that, and for me, if I was only going to have 2 bikes, my primary one would always be a trail mountain bike. But my second one probably would be a gravel bike, just because I want to go on those longer, more intense rides for 2 or 3 hours at a time without sort of having to stop. But I'm not a massive fan of just trundling on the tarmac all the time. I want to go and explore that little fire track or that little bit of single track I see, and therefore for me, a gravel bike works.
A general conclusion might be where you sit on the spectrum of cycling. Are you like a road rider that's looking to dabble in a bit of off-road riding, a couple of gravel events like the Dirty Reaver or a Rapha Prestige, then perhaps a gravel bike's a good shout. If you're a mountain biker, you already own a hardtail and you're kind of going to be dabbling in a bit of gravel riding for a bit of fun, then don't really see the point. But where do you think a cross rider sits on this spectrum?
Well, if you've got a cross bike and you're looking to replace it and you're debating whether you get a cross bike or a gravel bike, if you're going to race cross, or if the rides that you've been predominantly doing and you predominantly plan to do is short, intense, muddy rides in the woods and then get back, then get a cross bike. If you want to replace it with a bike and you're thinking you might do some longer rides and you might dabble in a bit of cross racing, then maybe the gravel bike will be a better bike for you.
So I guess a final thought would be that a gravel bike can be one of two things. It can be the ultimate N+1 bike for someone that's got 5 or 6 different bikes and they just want to keep filling the garage or house full of bikes. Or it can be the ultimate quiver killer, a bike that will do a lot of things reasonably well.
Certainly if you're not looking for a full-on mountain bike for technical trails, but you are looking for something drop-barred. It'll do road, it'll do cross, it'll do dirt roads. It'll do almost everything that any drop-barred bike could be expected to do.
But if you're waiting for the bike industry to stop trying to sell you more bikes, you're going to be waiting a long time.